Thirdly, we'll hear from the colleges and universities of the Anglican Communion, which is wonderful and also does very interesting work. So I hope this will be a stimulating and encouraging session. The first session will be concerning the work of the International Anglican Liturgical Consultation, which again has been very productive during COVID times. And if you were able to look at the papers that were filed, there's very interesting papers and resolutions. One is on the liturgical formation of all the baptized. One has to do with virtual communion, a question that came up, of course, during the coronavirus. Interesting. And the third has to do with an Anglican communion calendar. So those are all resolutions that are coming before you all as the Anglican Consultative Council. But the chair of the International Anglican Liturgical Consultation, the Reverend Dr. Simon Jones, is going to talk to us a little bit especially about liturgical formation. And I just want to say the International Anglican Liturgical Consultation has done amazing work for decades in the field of liturgy and has given great gifts to the ecumenical discussion of liturgy. As we know, the liturgical movement in the 20th century really transformed the liturgies of all of our churches. And Anglican liturgists were often at the head of those discussions and then have also had very fruitful discussions among themselves, giving gifts to the Anglican communion. So, Dr. Jones.
Thank you, Christopher. Good afternoon, everyone. So we're going to begin with another acronym, IALC. I'm not going to keep saying International Anglican Liturgical Consultation. IALC is what we are. And as Christopher said, we're the official network for liturgy of the Anglican Communion. And over the years, its biennial gatherings have led to the publication of a number of statements that have greatly influenced the way in which many churches of the Communion have engaged in liturgical renewal and revision. You might be aware of some of the statements, but the areas over which they've had the greatest influence have been initiation, the Eucharist, and ordination rites. One of the most significant of these is, I think, the Dublin Statement on the Eucharist. And that statement is now 30 years old. So given the development in liturgical scholarship over the last 3 decades, as well as the way in which the contexts in which the Eucharist is celebrated have both changed and diversified during this period, our next major piece of work is to revisit the Eucharist and to look at this material again, both at an online meeting this year and then in person in Seoul in South Korea this time next year. And as Christopher said, today IALC offers you 3 pieces of work to consider, each one with accompanying resolutions. The liturgical formation of all the baptized, virtual communion and the COVID-19 pandemic, and then an Anglican communion calendar. And what I want to do is talk briefly about the first of these, about liturgical formation, before handing over to Neil Vigers to talk about the calendar. And then at the end of the session, there'll be an opportunity for questions and comments, and we very much value those. Christians are made and not born. Those words come from the North African apologist Tertullian, who died in about the year 220, and are often cited to highlight the significance of the rites of initiation, both baptism and the Eucharist, as the means by which God makes Christians. The making of Christians doesn't take place as a one-off, standalone event, but as part of a process. By the time we get to the 4th century, the Church makes a distinction between the part of the process that happens before baptism, which it calls catechesis, and that which takes place afterwards, to which it gives the name mystagogy. Whereas in this early period, mystagogy consisted mainly of a short series of lectures to help the newly initiated live out the implications of what had happened to them at the font and the altar table, I think it's fair to say that in every age, and in whatever form it takes, post-baptismal mystagogy is a lifelong spirit-led process of making and remaking, of forming and reforming. Its purpose is nothing less than to grow into the full stature of Christ. Or to put it more simply and starkly, to become Christ. Now, some of you may have read Pope Francis's apostolic letter Desiderio Desideravi that was published last year. It's a wonderful piece of writing, and in it Pope Francis says this: the full extent of our formation is our conformation to Christ. We're becoming him. That's, of course, what Christians call theosis. And that's my starting point for this brief exploration of liturgical formation. For it is as we become more and more conformed to Christ that we're able to share in the mission of Christ, a mission articulated in the 5 marks, which are the theme of this week's meeting. Liturgical formation occupies an essential place within this lifelong process of Christian formation, of being conformed to Christ, of becoming him. And that's why IALC gathered in January 2019 in Hong Kong to consider this topic. And the result of our work is the document you have before you. But what precisely do we mean when we talk about liturgical formation? I think it's a rather slippery term, but it's most commonly used in 2 related ways. First, and most importantly, that Christians are formed through their participation in worship. Christians are formed through their participation in worship. And then second, that the church has a responsibility to form Christians for worship. There can be no formation for worship without formation through worship. Christians are formed through worship because liturgy is a privileged place of encounter with Christ. It's not the only place by any means, but it is the place where the possibility of the divine encounter is guaranteed and can be as real to us as it was to those first disciples on the road to Emmaus. So having given liturgy its primary place within this lifelong process of Christian formation, we need to remember that worship on its own, divorced from other aspects of the Christian life, is not enough to make a Christian. There's always the danger of worship becoming self-regarding and self-satisfying, worship for worship's sake, rather than worship for God's sake and for the sake of God's mission and God's world. Well, that said, from the perspective of my small corner of the Anglican Communion, I observe another danger, which may or perhaps may not reflect your own experience. And that is a loss of confidence in liturgical worship. That worship does what it says on the tin, with the result that some worshippers and worship leaders have low expectations of what happens when we gather for worship. Are we mindful of the fact that when we preside at worship, we are seeking to lead people into the mystery of God, to assist them on their spirit-driven journey to grow into the full stature of Christ? Are we attentive to the fact that when Scripture is proclaimed, the Word of God himself is speaking to his people, calling them into relationship with him? When we preside at the Eucharist, are we aware that we are being plunged into the furnace of God's love, to quote Pope Francis again? Do we rejoice that when we baptize, we are proclaiming the indelible identity of a child of God, who in the waters of the font experiences an intense, life-transforming encounter with Christ crucified and risen through the anointing of the Spirit. I believe that a loss of confidence in worship and consequently low expectations of it can be seen across all liturgical traditions and can manifest itself in a number of different ways. I'm going to offer a few observations, and then later on there'll be an opportunity for you to share some of yours if you have them. So here are just 4 of mine. For some people, concern about worship being ill at ease and out of sync with contemporary culture can lead it inadvertently to becoming entertainment, with the leader's primary focus shifting from God to the congregation. For others, an embarrassment about the use of symbols or a lack of confidence in their ability for them to speak for themselves can lead to them being skated over or explained before they're performed or joked about even in ways that render them mute. For still others, an inward-looking rubricism can prioritize a concern for doing it by the book over drawing people into the mystery of God. And then finally, concern about boredom arising from the regular repetition of liturgical texts leads some to use different alternatives as frequently as possible, thereby failing to allow people to build a spiritual library of cherished texts that are known by heart and can nourish worshippers both outside and inside the liturgical assembly. I note these because for me, in order to preside at worship in a way that enables people to be formed through liturgy, we need to be confident about what we're doing when we worship and why. To do so requires those of us who are privileged to preside at worship to have experienced formation through liturgy, as well as having been formed appropriately for liturgy. I'm reminded here of the words of Cyril of Jerusalem in one of his lectures to the newly baptized, those who had been formed through liturgy and were now being formed for it. He writes this of their experience of baptism: "What a strange and astonishing situation. We did not really die. We were not really buried. We did not really hang from a cross and rise again. Our imitation was symbolic, but our salvation a reality." That for me is a wonderful example of confidence in worship, as well as confidence in the ability of that worship to form Christians. I've quoted Pope Francis a couple of times already, and I'd like to conclude this section with another passage from the same letter that expresses his confident understanding of liturgical formation. He says this: "The liturgy takes us by the hand together as an assembly to lead us deep within the mystery that the word and sacramental signs reveal to us, so that the Spirit, plunging us into the Paschal mystery, might transform every dimension of our life, conforming us more and more to Christ." And there we are again, back to theosis. If we're prepared to accept such a positive and confident statement about worship and its essential and privileged role within liturgical formation and Christian formation, what are the implications for us and the way in which we and our churches understand and model this liturgical formation? That's the question that IALC attempts to respond to in its document, The Liturgical Formation of All the Baptized, and we hope that you find it helpful. Now, our work on virtual communion I've already referred to. There's a link to the document in the IASCFU paper, and you're welcome to ask questions about that at the end of this section. And I'm going to hand over to Neil, who's going to talk briefly about our work on the Anglican Communion calendar.
Thank you, Simon. Again, happy Valentine's Day. Without the calendar, there would be no Valentine's Day, no flowers, no chocolates, no cards. It's all down to the calendar. Calendars matter in church. You have a calendar in your phone, you have a calendar for this meeting, and we try to keep to it. The Christian year is shaped by the calendar, Christmas and Easter, but also the people whose lives were filled with Christ, the apostles, the evangelists, the saints, holy men and women who are remembered in the calendars of our home churches. Every church here has their own calendar. But we don't have an Anglican communion calendar, and we've been asked to see whether that might be possible. We've created a sample, an illustration, a model, so you could see what it might look like if ACC like the idea, and if you want us to create this, we will do it on your behalf. Some important things to bear in mind. The names on an Anglican communion calendar would be chosen by the member churches of the communion. They would be shared as gifts. You don't have to receive a gift, even a Valentine's Day gift. And from the names submitted, which are already on the official calendars of member churches, we can create a calendar for the communion that expresses our debt, our enrichment by holy lives lived in our own churches. We can share them with our other churches in this communion as gifts and say, receive the story of these people's lives of prayer and holiness, and use them in your own worship. Deepen your worship with these gifts, and deepen our sense of being a communion who are bound together by the life we have in worship, encountering God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and whose life can be seen in the marks of holiness in individual human lives. Calendars need to be reviewed. They don't stay set in stone. We offer you ideas for checking over your calendars. Do they still work? Do you need to retire some people in your home church calendar? Do you need new ones? It's a good thing, and there are notes there to guide you. But in the resolution that will come before ACC later, we ask you, would you like us to proceed and create from the gifts you offer a calendar for the communion, and to bring that back to the next ACC and see whether it works well enough for you? Does it do the job you want? Does it need to be changed? So I commend this to you for your consideration.
Thank you, Neil. We're going to charge right into the Legal Advisors Network. Some of you may have gotten a hold of the first volume of the Principles of Canon Law, common to the churches of the Anglican Communion, which was a great contribution to our common life when it first appeared in 2008. And we now have the great gift of the second edition, which we have a slide of, which is meant to make you desire the text if you don't have it. It's a wonderful resource for our common life. And the Venerable Alan Perry from the Anglican Church of Canada has come all the way to tell us about the project.
Thank you. The Anglican Communion Legal Advisors Network was established at ACC-12 with a mandate to produce a statement of shared principles of canon law common to the churches of the Anglican Communion, and to examine shared legal problems and possible solutions. The first edition of the Principles of Canon Law were originally published in time for the Lambeth Conference 2008. ACC-18 commended the principles for study, invited comment, and encouraged the provinces to use the network as a resource in dealing with legal issues in their provinces. By ACC-17, only 2 provinces had provided substantive comments, and no suggestions for any changes to the content had been received. The drafting group were working on a revision of the principles in anticipation of the 2020 Lambeth Conference. With the pandemic, this work was delayed. As noted in the report of the Legal Advisors Network, the work of revising the principles in advance of last year's meeting of the Lambeth Conference was picked up by the Centre for Law and Religion at Cardiff University and the Ecclesiastical Law Society. The revision of the principles involved the convening of 10 reading groups across 8 provinces of the Anglican Communion on 5 continents. Each reading group compared the principles to the canon law of their own province to determine whether the principles were consistent with their canon law. Where inconsistencies were found, or where there were suggestions for improvements in the wording of the principles, these were noted and passed along to the revision committee. As the convener of one of the reading groups, which met weekly from February to June of 2021, I can report that we all felt that the process was as enjoyable as it was edifying and instructive. If you've not yet had the chance to read it, I would commend in particular the reflection written by Bishop Vicente Kagabe, the Bishop of Lesotho, and a member of the revision committee. You'll find her reflection on page 125 of the book, or page 135 of the PDF version. That's a link to which has been sent to you. Bishop Kagabe quotes the presenter at a conference on canon law that she attended last year, who said, quote, that the Church is governed by law and not by whimsy. That is, we are subject to the rule of law rather than the arbitrary decisions of leaders in authority from time to time. The rule of law provides us with consistency and predictability in our governance structures. The principles themselves are not authoritative. As you know, legal authority in the Anglican Communion rests with the provincial synod in each province. Nevertheless, the principles are a valuable document. Let me suggest 2 ways in which they have value. First, as my own reading group discovered, reading through the principles provided a helpful lens to gain a better understanding of our canon law. Second, the principles suggested avenues of comparison with the canon law of other provinces, which may help us to share and develop best practices. It's this second aspect that I believe can be a significant contribution of the Legal Advisors Network to the life of the Anglican Communion. Allow me to give a practical example. Since the 19th century, the instruments of unity have wrestled with the question of the transfer of clergy from one province to another. Recommendation 1 of the 1878 Lambeth Conference raised the need for mutual respect of the disciplinary processes of each province, including a mechanism for the certification that a cleric moving from one province to another is a cleric in good standing. The same issue was addressed in a particular context by the Anglican Consultative Council in adopting the Charter for the Safety of People within the Churches of the Anglican Communion, that's a mouthful, and the associated Protocol for the Disclosure of Ministry Suitability Information between the Churches of the Anglican Communion. We don't seem to like short titles, do we? ACC-16 requested provinces to implement the protocol. So we find in the principles, there's the new version, Principle 13 on mutual respect, which restates the concern raised by the 1878 Lambeth Conference. The decisions and disciplinary processes of one church of the Anglican Communion should be respected by other member churches. And Principle 42 gives this practical application by indicating that a cleric moving from one diocese or province to another should be required by the receiving bishop to produce satisfactory evidence of ordination and good standing. To the extent to which these principles are reflected in the canon law of a province, They give effect to the protocol and to the original concern. None of this is particularly new or controversial. However, given the principle of provincial autonomy, it is up to each province to determine how best to implement these principles in its own context. My own province will be introducing legislation in our General Synod later this year to strengthen our canon on licensing, to apply these principles more explicitly. Regulation of licensing for us will depend more on law and less on whimsy. On a personal note, I can say that having visited the provincial synods in 8 provinces over the course of a few years, there is much among our provinces that's similar, and enough that's different that we may learn from each other. In his foreword to the principles of canon law, Archbishop Justin reckoned that perhaps 99% of Anglicans don't really care very much about canon law. With respect to Grace, I think that number might be understated. But may I encourage you to be the 1%, or to discover in your province the 1%, to encourage them to study the principles of canon law in the context of your own canon law. There is a resolution to that effect coming before you. It's my hope that with the reviving of the Legal Advisors Network, we may strengthen the bonds of affection between our provinces, develop our understanding of our own canon law, and share and develop best practices. In this way, our canon law can grow as a, quote, fifth instrument of unity, leading to more effective organization of each of our churches in our various contexts to engage in the mission that God calls us to. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And the last speaker for this session is the Reverend Canon Jamie Calloway from the colleges and universities of the Anglican Communion, which was founded in 1993 at a conference at Canterbury and became a network of the Anglican Communion in 2003. CUAC, don't you love the acronyms? Promotes higher Christian education in colleges and universities around the world that have an active presence within the Anglican Communion. And they have a gift to give us, I think, with respect to cross-cultural dialogue and formation of leaders in the Anglican Communion. So Canon Calloway.
Thank you, Christopher, and for noting our anniversary on March 29th. We'll be 30 years old. And CUAC follows the Association of Episcopal Colleges from 1962. So actually, as a network, we're now 60 years old shortly. On your table, among the detritus that has washed up, you will find our brochure. And there should be enough brochures for most of you to have one. This is the listing of the 160 Anglican colleges globally. And I ask you to open it and to take a look at your province particularly. And the question is, are you familiar with an Anglican college in your province? And if you are, raise your hand. All right. Table 5 is a little slow over here, but the other tables are doing well. All right, thank you. Now a second question. I don't always get that answer. This is a nice group. The second question is, did anyone here attend an Anglican college? Raise your hand. If you attended an Anglican college, stand up. We want to see you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Jamie Calloway, General Secretary of the network we call CUAC, joined by Professor James Combo, Vice Chancellor of St. Paul's University in Limuru, who is the convener of our African chapter. And since we're in Africa, I thought we should hear primarily from the ground. Today is the third mark of mission, A student's journey in Anglican higher education is challenged first by the opportunity of becoming. A young person in the independent life of a university in a supportive environment has the opportunity of unfolding possibilities of becoming. And they may have been sent to go to law school, or they may have been desiring to go into financial management, or whatever else their parents or their society told them. But in a good liberal education, you see there are many possibilities, and often people who come in this direction, in this life of becoming, find other opportunities in the gifts that God has given them that education helps them to express. So the first thing we should think about, in my experience with higher education, is this journey of becoming. But there's a second journey that's a window here, and it's a little different. It is the journey of discovering that you have neighbors, and that your neighbors have needs, and that your responsibilities in life, I'm getting a signal from the translator, that your neighbors have needs, and that your responsibilities in life are not your own betterment, but to the ability to be able to give and to offer support to them. Our colleges and universities do this through programs of community service, what is called community engagement. And this allows them to see the broader world, that it's not just about them. Some of our universities, like many of our universities, have a requirement for so many credits of community service each year in order to graduate. Others have specific programs, and an example is at Bard College in Annandale on Hudson, New York. They started a prison ministry. There was no education in prison. One Bard student went and started teaching classes, and the result was now a Bard prison college. And they have graduated almost 500 students from Bard College who did all their work behind bars. This is this journey of seeing that the world's not just about me. And you see, the third mark of mission is when we turn from forming the individual to the individual giving and offering to the society. Now I turn to Professor Combo to give you a report from the ground, which will be followed by your questions.
Good afternoon. I think I should move closer to this machine over here. First of all, I want to take this opportunity to appreciate my friend Jamie for inviting me and involving me in this very important moment, and to meet all of you here. I also want to take this opportunity to appreciate my Archbishop, His Grace Jackson, for allowing me to come over and to leave the matters of St. Paul's University at a time when the university is very busy. The way Archbishop Jackson is the chair of the Council of St. Paul's University. I will not get into the theories and the deeper discussions on this matter of Anglican universities. I think Jamie did a good job asking us the levels of familiarity with the Anglican universities within the different provinces. And I think that was very well covered. What I will do is just to share my experience. As a Vice Chancellor of an Anglican university, I face every day the issues and the challenges that I believe when shared in this manner and in a forum like this can also help in terms of channeling and changing and giving direction to our very good institutions of higher learning. I have had a challenge, but also a privilege of being a Vice Chancellor of an Anglican university for now going 3 years. Before that, of course, there were other things. There are a few things that I want to share with us so that even as we think about universities that are Anglican by creation, by origin, then we try to see how best we can work together with these universities in order for our vision to be clarified and everything about us to be clear, even as we engage with the Anglican universities. As you raised up your hands at the questions that were raised by James, it was very clear that there was a number, not very significant, but there was a number that did not raise up their hands. In other words, they were submitting that they may not know very well Anglican universities within the domain. And that could also tell that it's possible that there might have been no such institutions within their provinces, but the truth of the matter probably is that Anglican universities are there, but they are not sure whether they are there or not. And you're aware that that is a very dangerous position. Very dangerous because we own them, and we vote, we send professors there, or sometimes members of council and so forth. They come from our churches, and so because they come from our churches, it is important that we follow up where they go and what sorts of decisions they make. And so this is important, the fact that we should, and a number of us thankfully know and relate very clearly and very effectively with the universities. The urge is that those who may not as yet be very conversant with the Anglican universities, that after here we give ourselves a challenge to actually know them, because they belong to us and they are ours. But secondly, I want to mention very quickly the issue of programs. What will distinguish one Anglican university from the others? Or what will distinguish an Anglican university from a university that belongs maybe to the Presbyterian Church or to any other church? It should be the issue of inspirations. What is it that inspires? What is it that inspires? If we are talking about the Anglican university, then we must be saying that we are conversant with the issue of what distinguishes, what separates off an Anglican university from the other. And if we can't answer that question, then what that means is that we need to go back to the drawing board and to be able to, cut it out, be able to carve it out, we be able to release it, move it from the larger body, and be able to say, this is what this university that we have raised and that we have funded and so forth should be able to stand for. As we stand, that area might not have been, might not be very clear, and yet it is one of those things that must be very, very clear. The other thing about the Anglican universities that I am familiar with is the issue of chaplaincy. The issue of chaplaincy. At the moment, there isn't very clear guidelines on how this ought to operate. And universities, once they have carved out themselves and they are in operation, put in place very well understood types of chaplaincies, and yet this is where a very important component of the administration of the institution should be getting its guidance from either the province or from somewhere. Maybe if it is a diocesan university, then it should then be getting their directive from there, so that it is very clear that this university is Anglican, and therefore, because it is Anglican, its chaplaincy formation follows that which you and I will find and see in the Anglican Church. Now, one of the things about chaplaincies, of course, is the fact that this is the moment of formation that we have just seen here. You go to this particular university if you are a strong believer and from the position that you want to follow your formation from the context, from the point in mind that you are actually following the traditions as they have been set and moved in the context of chaplaincy. So chaplaincy is a very key component of what we should be going for. If you have a son, you have a daughter that wants to go to a university, the one that will take care of the heart and the mind of that young person, that person is going to be the one that has a very strong chaplaincy. You can look at the chaplaincy programs and you can be satisfied that here I am, I have arrived with my daughter, with my son, and I am leaving them in the mind, in the hands of an institution that will care for the spirituality of this young man or that young man. So chaplaincy is crucial, and anybody who wants to think seriously about where they are placing their young people should be looking again at the chaplaincy programs in these institutions. I'm rushing very much to the point of closing because I'm cutting off on the other issues that Jami did mention, but I want to say something about community service. Universities are about three things. The first thing about the university is teaching. The kind of programs that are there that would attract instruction. It's important to note that. The second thing about universities is community service. Going out there to reach out the community and to be able to share with the community what it is that the university is about. And of course the last of those is research. The importance of research here is the fact that you are going to benefit the church as a Christian, as an Anglican university, because at the end of the day you are informing the church by way of research what needs to be done, where and when, and things like those. Those are not things that are ad hoc. Those are the sorts of things that are planned and put in place, and a good research done to back up the decisions that are being made. And as I move on, I think I want to mention one last thing, which is something that every university, private in particular, is struggling with, and that is the area of funding. How do we finance? How do we reach out to our communities for purposes of financing and engaging the communities that we serve, so that at the end of the day we have some level of funding that goes and that feeds in the instructions and the programs of the university. Now, in the case of St. Paul's, I would say that we have had the privilege of being probably the only university in Kenya that after 1 year we still look at our accounts and we are able to see that we have some surplus that comes at the end of the year. I'm saying this not because I want to boast here that that indeed is what is the case at St. Paul's, but I'm saying it because looking at the various and the many other universities in the ground, we find that this is an area of a lot of pain, and a number of institutions are closing, a number of universities are closing, and some of them are experiencing extremely hard situations because of this. And so as we think about our universities, this is one thing that we need to think about, we need to look at, we need to turn around and be able to see how else we can work through this. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Let me be very quick. ACC-17 took our request to have an Anglican schools network. On the traffic light system, it was green. The standing committee in November gave it a green. There now is a core that is starting the Anglican schools network from Australia, UK, Honduras, and Japan, and there will be a sign-up sheet on the Anglican College table for you to list school networks in your province that they should call on in establishing the Anglican schools network. There are probably 1,000 Anglican schools worldwide, so this is a very substantial effort, and we need to hear from you as to where the schools are that should be included. Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you, Professor Combo and Canon Calloway. We're finished. Thank you for your patience with this session, and we are on a break, and we will come back at the appropriate time for the resolutions session. Really? Okay.